everybody assumes that the government obviously will continue with the current framework for feed-in tariff, and that's why we have seen a lot of interest, and there has been a lot of M&A activity in the brownfield feed-in tariff, both for PV and wind farms. So I think that they have complete confidence in the Spanish market, the international investors.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Ana Barrias, head of Iberia at Aurora. My guest on the show today is Roger Font Garcia. Roger is the Global Head of Project Finance, Asset and Specialized Lending at Sabadell, a role he took in January of last year after several senior roles at the bank. Under Roger's leadership, Sabadell has really embraced the Spanish renewable market with a much higher degree of merchant exposure. Since 2018, Sabadell has financed 71 projects in Spain and Portugal, representing over 6.4 gigawatts and a total amount of financing of 3.4 billion euros. Within that, over 1 gigawatt have been financed on a purely merchant basis, that is, without PPAs. Probably one of the only banks, if not the only, financing on a purely merchant basis. So I can't think of anyone better to have on this podcast to talk about project financing in Spain and the market for renewable projects more generally than Roger. Roger, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity.
Roger, for those that might be a bit less familiar with Sabadell and its approach to project financing, would you mind providing an overview of your approach?
We started financing renewables back in 1992, and we were one of the big players in the first, let's say, renewable boom in Spain until 2014. And we financed close to 14, we participated in the financing of 14, 15 gigawatts in Spain until 2014. And we were a structuring bank or one of the leading banks in 6 gigawatts in Spain, especially in wind farms and also in CSP. And then back in 2018, when we started to analyze the auction system in Spain, the 2016 and 2016, we saw that the economics for merchant financing were possible. That's why we worked with our risk department to build a risk framework in which we could offer our clients both auction transactions under 2016-2017, transactions merchant with PPA, both investment grade and non-investment grade, but also in terms of pure merchant transaction, on all of them, both in wind and in PV.
Thank you, Roger. So we're going to be talking about the Spanish market today. And for our listeners that might not be fully aware of every twist and turn the market has taken over the last few years, I just wanted to provide a few bits of context. So after a boom in both solar and wind development in the mid-2000s, investment effectively came to a halt following a set of retroactive changes to feed-in tariffs that started in about 2010 and culminated in a complete redesign of the mechanism in 2013. Unsurprisingly, all activity in the renewable space was from that point focused on legal disputes and claims against the Spanish government in domestic and international courts. But as Roger was just saying before, the appetite for investment has been picking up again over the last couple of years. Largely, this is supported by decreasing technology cost and a great kind of renewable economics for wind and solar, namely in the form of high load factors. Solar installed capacity has doubled in the last 2 years to just over 10 gigawatts, and wind capacity has increased by over 3 gigawatts to about 27. The government ran renewable auctions in 16 and 17, and just recently announced a renewable auction scheme that sees 19 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity auction between 20 and 25. This is all in the context of a national energy and climate plan that sees over 50 gigawatts of renewables installed between 2020 and 2030, and a pipeline of projects that exceeds well over 120 gigawatts. So, Roger, this is clearly a very active market, attracting a large number of investors, and there's been a lot of work for banks like Sabadell to do. So, can you tell us a little bit how this very colorful regulatory and market context has impacted project financing in Spain?
Well, up to this point, I think that obviously the auctions in 2016 and 2017 were a big help as the starting point to do renewables back into Spain. And once the market saw that the merchant with PPA or merchant, it made economic sense, and the funds could offer their shareholders some interesting returns, probably 2 or 3% above other countries. It started a race to build as many projects as possible and to get their megawatt ready to build. There has been a lot of buying and selling megawatt ready to build. So since those were merchant bases with PPA or without PPA, the regulatory factor hasn't affected the development. We are still seeing a lot of interest from sponsors to continue with their projects. Everybody's talking with a lot of megawatts and gigawatts in some cases, and they are not focusing on the new auction that the government announced. They are going ahead even though there's the auction planning. So a lot of the sponsors that they had on a strategy to go with PPAs, they continue to go with PPAs, even if the PPA prices has changed a little bit between pre-COVID and post-COVID, but they're still continuing to doing so. And even the sponsors that they want, they are looking for projects under totally merchant basis, they are continuing to go ahead. So I wouldn't say that it hasn't affected that much the regulatory framework.
That's great. And we'll talk about COVID and we'll talk about the auctions as well during this podcast. But just before we get into that, I mentioned earlier that Sabadell is one of the only banks that lends on a purely merchant basis. So I think it's interesting to understand kind of what enables you to take on that merchant risk, or said another way, where do you think Sabadell's views of the merchant risk might differ to other banks that it allows you to provide financing without the need for PPAs?
I think that it depends on each bank and what the experience of each bank in the previous, before 2014. In our cases, I have to say that the project finance team and the risk department team made a great analysis back in 2018 and could build something and agree on some framework that it allows for us to be comfortable. Another aspect to have into consideration is that obviously we are the fourth or the fifth largest bank in Spain. There are three major banks in Spain that they have business everywhere in the world or everywhere in a lot of countries. So there's a lot of market, and they may have chosen to go with feed-in tariff in France, with feed-in tariff in Northern Europe, or maybe Australia. In our case, we focus on Spain, also in the UK, US, and LATAM. But in Spain, that is our core market. So we put a lot of development into building a strong franchise in Spain. And for us, the merchant financing, it makes sense. If we do a analysis of the prices that are expected in the midterm and the long term, if we put a framework in which we have a debt service cover ratio higher than we would be with PPA, with short-term tenors, we feel perfectly comfortable with that framework. I have to say also that everybody's focusing on Sabadell as the merchant financing, but last year, out of the whole production, only 15% was merchant, because we made a lot of transactions with PPA and feed-in tariff. And this year, only close to 20% are merchant. So it's about finding the right mix between feed-in tariff, merchant with PPA, pure merchant, and now we are going to see auction transactions again.
Great. Roger, we talked a little bit about COVID, or we mentioned it at least in the previous segment. So let's talk a little bit about that. It's hard to have a podcast in 2020 and not talk about this. So this has clearly been a challenging kind of year on a number of fronts, and renewable project financing is no different. If you had known in the middle of 2019 what you now know in terms of the effects of COVID in the power market in Spain, would you have done anything differently, do you think?
I think that the only change we would have done is what we did back in March, in terms that we adjusted the base curve that we use in our base case. Besides that, we continued with our structure in terms of the transactions, in terms of the tenor, the cash sweep, the debt service cover ratio. But obviously, we had to adjust the electricity curve that we use on our base case, and we did it. We adjusted it in January a little bit in respect to what we had in 2019, and then in March we adjusted it again to take into consideration the new prices, and that was it's what I would have done.
Understood. More long term, do you think that project finance will change dramatically as we emerge from COVID? So are banks more likely to be more cautious, I guess, on how they size that following the what we saw this year?
I think that banks look at the renewables as a medium and long term with solid fundamentals. It's a good business to be in. It's essential for society to move to a more sustainable society. It will be very important with the electrification of society, and in the fundamentals are really strong. So I don't think it will have a great impact on how the banks perceive renewable. Obviously, I think that one of the myths that there were that the electricity prices would never went down, it's what it fell. So now the banks will have to take a closer look at the electricity prices, at the curve, and the most importantly, each bank will have to find their view on the electricity prices in order to build the base case. But in general, I don't think it will have an impact. Uh, the only thing is that it will force us to look more on the electricity price curve.
Yeah, that makes sense. And obviously we agree with that. So this was obviously a big shock to the system, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the long-term fundamentals of the market or of renewable investment. So it's great to know that others are thinking about it that way as well. We also talked or mentioned again some kind of renewable auctions. We know that the last kind of feed-in tariff regime in Spain and that in the government being embattled in arbitration cases for the last 7 years or so. So, in the context of this new auction scheme, in your view, will investors or lenders play a significant risk premium on investing in Spain following the retroactive changes that we saw in the early 2000s? Or is that water under the bridge and investors are not particularly worried about the regulatory and political risk anymore?
I think that these auctions are completely different to the ones that we had in mid 2000 or 2010, and they are nothing alike. Obviously, I think that the investors came back to Spain once they saw that they could do merchant with PPA or merchant transactions. So a lot of them came back because they didn't need any regulatory framework or any subsidy. And even with the brownfield feed-in tariff, there has been a lot of interest of international investors in buying and acquiring projects, brownfield feed-in tariff. So it has been demonstrated that the investors in general, they believe in even in the old feed-in tariff, and they don't expect any governmental change. Basically, because all the renewable capacity is built into the system, the auction price, which I'm sure we are going to talk later, it's going to be lower than the current market price. So we haven't seen any reluctance into coming back to Spain.
That's great. And in terms of kind of how you assess kind of the government as an off-taker, I guess, or a counterparty, do you think that has changed at all following what happened in kind of 2010, 2013?
Since the mix in electricity output is completely different, so we'll see that the brownfield feed-in tariff will be a smaller percentage, and then the new capacity in renewables, it will merchant or merchant with PPA, and the new auctions are going to be the lower price. Everybody assumes and that the government obviously will continue with the current framework for feed-in tariff, and that's why we have seen a lot of interest, and there has been a lot of M&A activity in the brownfield feed-in tariff, both for PV and wind farms. So I think that all they have complete confidence in the Spanish market, the international investors.
Brilliant. So we now know that there will be a renewable auction. It's in theory going to happen this year still, 2020, although that is increasingly unlikely, at least to actually run the auction. But we do have more visibility now on the amount of capacity that will be auctioned. And it's quite large. We're talking about 19 gigawatts of new wind and solar capacity in the next 5 years. So we've been talking a little bit about kind of merchant risk and merchant projects. Do you think that having this renewable auction running in parallel to what I think will continue to be a fairly fertile merchant market, do you think it increases the risk to merchant projects in the sense that you don't naturally have an equilibrium in where if capture prices fall below kind of the LCO of your projects and people stop investing, now you have something that is sitting alongside this market in where the incentives might not be as aligned?
We'll have to see, and time will decide. I mean, obviously now we need specific details about the auction in terms of the tenor and if there's difference between the technologies. And also, more importantly, we'll have to see who is bidding and who is winning, and if what kind of sponsors or companies they are finally awarded. In terms of the analysis, we have been monitoring the analysis by experts such as you and others, and we see that obviously there's going to be the capture price in solar, it's going to go down because of all the capacity. But even with all the analysis, even if you take the low curve, the mid curve, the mid low, it makes sense to invest in projects both in merchant and merchant with PPA. So we don't see that there's any slowdown in the interest in new projects. And as I said at the beginning, quite the opposite. Every day we talk with the sponsors that they have megawatt ready to build in 21, 22, 23, and they are eager to put to advance with the licenses so that they can put into place their project.
Brilliant. And the other related issue, I guess, when you talk about kind of the merchant business model, and as you said before, it's mostly supported by PPAs. There's only a small portion that is purely merchant. Do you think the auction affects the PPA market? And if so, how?
One would think that it affects. However, if we looked at and that was my fear when I looked at the Portuguese auction, last year's auction and this year's auctions, and we haven't seen any change in terms of the prices of the PPAs after the auction. They understand that obviously we'll have some capacity that it's going to be priced well below the current PPA markets, but it's understood that they'll be out of the mix in the electricity price, and we haven't seen that much of a change.
Great. And you actually mentioned the Portuguese auctions, and the reality is that it's hard to talk about the potential outcome of the Spanish auctions without discussing the record-breaking results from the Portuguese auctions, both in 2019 and 2020. So for our listeners that might have missed it, the Portuguese solar auction last year saw the lowest bid come in at 14.7 euros per megawatt hour, a global record at that point. If that wasn't shocking enough, though, this year's lowest bid was of 11 euros per megawatt hour. Now, I think it's fair to say that there are significant differences between the scheme in both countries, not least because you are also securing a connection point through the Portuguese auction, which you are not in Spain, at least not in the way it's currently defined. But nonetheless, given that both countries effectively share a wholesale market, I wanted to ask, can you provide that financing at all with the prices that we saw in the Portuguese auction, Roger?
It depends of, there are certain aspects that we need to take into consideration, as you mentioned. One is that some sponsors were bidding aggressively because in order to have the connection point. One, it's because at least on the first auction was pre-COVID, so some of the sponsors may have done optimistic assumptions regarding the price. The others is that they may have expected, since low investment costs, since the auction allowed you 3 years period in order to connect. some of the sponsors thought that in 1 or 1 year and a half they could get a lower investment cost. So the financing, it all depends on the investment, pretty much on the investment cost. Obviously, the electricity price post 15-year regulatory period, we are going to be more conservative probably than what we were last year. So this is going to put a cap on the merchant tail, on the merchant revenues that we take into consideration into the base case. However, if we take into the average total investment cost per megawatt, which it's around 700,000 per megawatt in solar, and 1 million or 1.1, close to 1 million in wind farm, in our models, we could finance between 30 and 40% only. That's taking into consideration 700. Then, if the projects that come out have an investment cost lower than 600 or 500, then it's what, in terms of leverage percentage, it increases. However, if we take the gross amount of leverage per megawatt, obviously it has to be less than what transaction with PPA or merchant.
Absolutely. Do you have a prediction, Roger, as to where the Spanish auctions will clear?
No, I don't. I would assume that when the Spanish government set out the auctions, they were looking at the neighboring countries, and they expect to have some electricity price similar as the other country as possible. However, I don't know, in terms of the Spanish auction, it's much bigger than Portugal, than the Portuguese one, and there are a lot of players, many more players. You have different kind of players, as you saw in Portugal. You have some traditional IPPs, you have some sponsors. So you have different players with different IRRs and maybe different cost of financing in which they can adjust their bid. So we'll have to see. We saw in the Portuguese auction some players that participate in the whole supply chains from beginning to end. So they have the clients and they have the projects, so they can manage the whole supply chain. So we'll see. We'll have to see.
If you had a wish to the Spanish government in terms of how the auctions are structured, what would it be?
I mean, obviously, we still know the details about the auction pretty much into elements. One, the tenor of the regulatory period, and the other, if it will be differentiated by technologies. In my view, it's better to have a more balanced mix if you differentiate by technology. So you have one solar, one limit for solar, and then the other limit for wind farm, and then you have more for specific technologies. Then regarding the tenor, I personally like either 20 or 10 years. A 10-year regulatory period would be easier for the banks in the sense that it will be closer to what we are currently doing with the merchant transactions with PPA, which in Spain it's usually 10 years. So it will be very easy to adapt for the banks, the structures to those kind of transactions. And 20 years, it will be easier to adapt to the current feed-in tariff transactions, especially in wind, since it will be the same regulatory period. In PV, it's 30 years, so it will be different. But it will be more, the longer the tenor, the more accurate the price would be in terms of the average. No, the 15-year period is kind of a strange because it's not similar to the 10-year period like a PPA transaction, and it's different from the 20-year, and then you have to work a little bit more into detail on the merchant tail, what prices you put into that. So it's more, it will force us to be more, take more assumptions, and there could be more differences between the banks. So I would say that one, differentiate by technology, and then the other, I would rather see a 10 or 20 year instead of a 15 years.
Interesting. Well, I guess the
but
details.
That's my personal view. That's my personal view, not the bank's view.
Yes, no, of course. And the reality is we still have to see what will happen and when all of the parameters are published. any day now, I guess, if the aim is still to hold the auctions this year.
Yeah.
So, Roger, thank you very much. We've talked very quickly about a number of different topics. We've covered kind of your approach to project financing, the impact of COVID, the impact of renewable auctions, including comparisons to the Portuguese auction. So I think that's been a great kind of quick run through topics that I think are very important to anyone investing in Spain. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me and share your views with our listeners.
Anna, thank you very much. It has been a great opportunity for me to talk about the different issues.
That was Ana Barrias, head of Iberia at Aurora, speaking to Roger Font Garcia, global head of project finance, asset and specialised lending at Sabadell. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.